All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Dan Quagliana. I'm the head of developer relations at Zebra Technologies, and we're going to be talking about Android security today. So I'm really impressed that so many of you are actually interested in this topic. We're going to be going in, really diving into the whole ecosystem. So Android itself, the way apps are used, and the way the whole components of the ecosystem come together. So just to give a little background on myself and Zebra. So Zebra Technologies, we work with 95% of the Fortune 500, and our role is really to help these companies get better visibility to their assets and their operations. We do this through barcoding, RFID, locationing, and just to give some examples of use cases. So Home Depot is one of our customers. Each of their store associates is using one of our Android smartphones so that they can track all the assets within their store. They can tell those employees what they're supposed to do, look up pricing. In kind of like the route delivery space, FedEx is another one of our customers. Every package you receive has one of our labels printed on it. They're using our scanners, our smartphones as well there, so they can do their deliveries, know where they're supposed to go, and track every one of those millions or billions of packages. And then in healthcare, imagine you go into the hospital, you have a barcoded wristband on, and your nurse is going around looking at what she's supposed to be doing, what the right tasks are, and then they want to make sure that each of those medications you get is the right medication for you. Every blood draw sample is being attributed to you so that we can kind of cut down on some of the mistakes made. That's an area we have, like, I think 150,000 mistakes are made every year that drive more hospitalizations. So that's where Zebra plays. And one of the biggest questions we get is Android secure? So clearly this is a loaded question, because I would say really nothing is actually secure these days. And when you look in the media, they are very quick to point out that there are tons of vulnerabilities, there are tons of issues, and you're really very sensationalized about that. But even when you look at just Android on itself, that's not even the whole picture here. So lately the big thing has been about crack. Well, crack is really just a wireless protocol issue. So that is not an issue with Android, but it affects every single user of an Android device as well as other wireless devices. So all of this really comes into play. But I think some of these are kind of funny actually. So like this stage fright one, it only takes one text to hack 950 million Android phones. And I'm not really sure how many contacts they have that they're able to hit all 950 million people. But they take some of this data, and yes, there were 950 million devices that were susceptible to it, but it takes a little more to get into that. And so what we're going to do today, we're going to talk through not only some of these examples and the reality of what's going on, but some of the advances that Android has made through a lot of the flavors that's really enhanced that security offering, and then what you can do as a developer to enhance your application, and also how the usage can be enhanced to help provide more security as Android devices are being used. So, we saw some of those. So I talked about stage fright. So the reality, and this is data from Android Security Report that came out more towards the beginning of the year. So when this initially came out, the claim was 95% of Android devices are vulnerable. The reality is that before that was announced, not a single, we were not aware of any devices that were actually impacted. Android had fixes for that before that public release, and after that, none had actually been impacted. So a lot of these, there is an exploitation, there is a possibility, but what is actually being impacted? And then I wanted to kind of dive into Blueborn. So this is another one. This is a Bluetooth vulnerability that came out. And so looking at the reality of what happened here. So company Armis was able to identify 4 different vulnerabilities that could potentially impact this. They reached out to Microsoft, to Apple, to Google, a number of other companies back in April. They outlined these vulnerabilities that could impact those devices. So before this was publicly acknowledged, the Google team went behind the scenes, they came up with fixes for these. Within the ecosystem, obviously, Google themselves only has their Nexus devices. There's tons of OEM partners making their devices. So that whole partner community gets notified once Google has those fixes back in August. And then September 4th, Google made their own security patches publicly available for those that aren't in that partner network. And then it wasn't until September 12th that the public announcement about Blueborn was actually made. So when you're talking about, all these devices that could be vulnerable, in a lot of cases, fixes were already available before that announcement was made. And just to give some examples, so Zebra with our own Android devices, we had our patch publicly available on September 8th prior to that announcement. So that kind of gives you a little sense that don't always trust what you see in the headlines, but really try to do a little more research to understand what's happening behind the scenes. So next, I really wanted to go through what is Android doing today and what have they been doing over the last few years to enhance what's going on in the security space. So this is a chart that Google puts together so you can really understand, Google is doing a big portion of what's happening, but they're engaging with multiple audiences here. So they have you guys, the application developers. They have their whole services group that's looking at Google Play, other different services they're offering. They have the device makers. And all of that's kind of pulling together with this user ecosystem as well. And so all of these are different people that really share some ownership in the security of Android. And so the hope is, as we go through this, you guys are really taking a little more ownership of that as well. I said in one of the sessions this morning, Anna went through how to, looking at penetration testing on your apps, and it was kind of terrifying just at the app level what can happen. And so some of the things we'll go through, she went through some examples, but I'm going to have another few examples of some APIs and things that Google's actually put in place you can include in your apps to help validate some of the security. So first we're going to kind of go through the platform. This is a slide that the Android Enterprise team has put together. So Enterprise really looking at business usage of Android devices. They have some different use cases. I'm going to go through those in a second here. But really what you can see is, I would say in Lollipop, that was really the time when Android really made a huge push to start giving better control, having more depth to the security they had. So some of these items that are up here, but we're going to go later into Google Play Protect, which is something that Google just branded this year at I/O, but they actually started putting into place a lot of the work that they've done back when they launched Lollipop. So I'm not going to really go through each of these, but you can see that there's a lot of things. A lot of these are around user management. How do you get devices up and ready? How do you make sure users are doing the right things with the devices? And also just kind of in the platform space. So they've done a lot here. So whether we're looking at, sandboxing applications, controlling what different apps have rights to, talking app to app, apps talking to different parts of the device, going into actually, full disk encryption, making sure that the contents on your device are encrypted, and then things even like verified boot. So this is making sure that the device is not been kind of corrupted, the image is what it's supposed to be. I think a lot of people like to root devices, maybe some folks in this room, but that whole process does open things up to vulnerabilities, or if there's some malicious intent going on where someone is trying to root someone else's device, some of these things can really help detect that. So here I wanted to just talk through some of the personas. I think most of us think of just our consumer usage of an Android device. So that's, I have my phone, I take advantage of it, I have complete control, no one else is really using my device. There's actually a lot of other use cases, and this is what we see in the business world. So there's the whole bring your own device concept, and I think people are probably pretty familiar with that. So that's, I own my own device, I'm going to take that into my work and use it for some work functions. And when you think about that, that actually it introduces risk for an employer. Do you really, that employer doesn't know what I'm doing with my device. Maybe I rooted it. Maybe I'm, sideloading some weird apps off, some web page that could have some malicious activity. And so that introduces issues. So we're going to go into, some of the things that have gone in, Android's done to help out with that type of use case. And you also have company-owned devices. So for me personally, my work provides me with my phone. And on that phone, I am able to install my own apps, but then they also give me some apps. And then there's devices that are just completely set aside for work use only. And then the last category, and this is where Zebra's devices we make, so that's corporate-owned single-use devices. And that adds a different twist because what we often see here is you'll have multiple users using the same device. And sometimes they all have access to the same things, and your employer is going to lock down what they can do. But at the same time, you might have different users who you want to have different access to different things. So it's kind of twisting things around. So for each of these use cases, Google's actually implemented a number of different tools that we can use. And I think one of the most important ones is just management. So the first stage when we talk about management is the actual deployment. So how do you get your device? What access do you have to it? And what can you do with that? So there's a number of different tools that are set up there. Zebra and Google both have some things. So you can scan a barcode and that kind of sets a profile and a personality on the device. You can also use NFC to do the same type of thing. We even have audio that you can do that. EMM, so EMM is Enterprise Mobility Management. That's a big area that comes into particularly this enterprise space. So how are you going to manage what is on each of these devices? So there's a bunch of companies, I think like AirWatch, Mobile Iron, Sodi. There's a really big community out there. And one of the things Android did was they came out and they created some standard APIs so that all these companies would be engaging with that device in the exact same way. That way you're not having each company come out with their own method that could potentially introduce some issues. So we have these standard EMM APIs. Zero Touch is something that's brand new, and that came out, and that's an Android method that you can easily provision a device, that a device owner can go set that up and set the access that's there. So the device management, I talked about EMM. I'm going to go into depth on the work profile. So that's something that allows you to set up a certain profile within your own device that's for work. And then device owner is particularly for those work-owned devices. You as the user may not be the owner of the device, so they don't want to give you complete control. They want to maintain control. That's often tied in with one of those EMM softwares. And then there's the whole app management side. And the app management side is really important, so we're going to dive into that as well. There's a lot of features through Google Play Protect, and that's actually a big area in which a lot of vulnerabilities are introduced through those apps that are coming onto the devices. Here I just wanted to do a little bit of a plug for Zebra. So this is this management side. This is a key component of what we do. So we have a suite that we call Mobility DNA. We break that down into our developer tools, the management tools. There's some kind of productivity utilities that we have, and then just some software applications. So I mentioned a little bit Stage Now. That's a tool that we have that you can use those barcodes, NFC or whatever to provision a device. So earlier I mentioned customers like Home Depot and FedEx. These are customers with literally tens of thousands of devices. When you buy that many devices, how do you get those set up? And how do you make sure those users of each of those devices are only getting access to what you want them to have access to? All right. So when I talked about management, I mentioned the work profile, or the managed or work profile. So really the way that this works is, this is when you own your phone, but you're going to use it for work purposes. So you don't want to give ownership, like the device ownership, over to your organization, but at the same time you want to be able to have access to those applications. So you are able to set up this work profile And I think you can kind of see in the screenshot there, what it does is it pulls up these certain apps that are designed in that work profile. And they are apps that are exclusively limited to that profile. You're able to set the permissions for what those apps have access to do on your device, and really kind of partition them off into a different subset. This is something you, as the user, at any time can disable that profile so that the device owner of the work profile, so if I'm an employee of another company, I can turn that work profile off so they no longer have access to that. So that's giving me, the owner, some control, but also giving that company I work for some control as well. The device owner concept is when I don't really own the device. And so often you're going to set up your EMM as give that permissions to be the device owner. And then by doing that, when you set that device up, it then can limit what you can do on that device. So the really nice thing here that we see from companies is they may say they can open this up. So in Google Play, you have access to any app or only a certain subset of those apps. You also then can go into a managed Play Store, and a managed Play Store is really like a corporate account of the Google Play Store. And so you can have essentially like a private app. So if I work for, we'll say Home Depot again, they're going to have applications that they don't want the public to see at all. They're going to take that application, they're going to have their own private Play Store that only people with these devices have access to. And so they can set that up. By going through that managed Play Store, they get all the benefits of Google Play. We're going to go through a lot of the testing, the security that's in that. They get those benefits, but there's no public awareness of that. The device owner also has the ability that if there's a private hosted app outside of Google Play, they can manage those apps on that device as well. So some of the services. This is where we dive into Google Play Protect. So I think you guys all are aware, there's over 2 billion active devices now that are running through GMS, Google Managed Services, that are using Google Play. So 2 billion devices, massive number, and through this service, they are actively scanning and monitoring every app that goes through there and changes made to those apps. So that means they are doing scanning, so static analysis. They can analyze some of the code that's running on the app. They can do dynamic, so they have emulators, they can do that. They're doing comparisons of app versus app, and even some of the developer profiles of who's putting those apps up there. So they're scanning through everything. This is something that came out, it launched in Google I/O, like I mentioned earlier, but it's been in practice since Lollipop. And I think when you looked prior to Lollipop, the Play Store really was, there was a lot in there that maybe people weren't as comfortable with. And since then, I think there's been a lot of refinement, and you've seen a lot of some of the dangerous, malicious apps have decreased. And kind of speaking through that, so one of the biggest things that we really would recommend is that use Google Play. Do not use other methods of getting your app on there. So when you look at all the scanning that they're doing, we really, as users, want to take advantage of that. If you're not taking advantage of that, you have multiple times of a risk of putting a malicious app on your device. Going through Google Play, it's only down to, this is little old numbers from the Android Security Report, but less than 0.05% of apps have malicious potential in them. So this really shows some of the impact of that Google Play. So earlier I mentioned the Managed Play Store, but I didn't talk about the Managed Play account. So when you think of, we mentioned some of these owners, they're rolling out many, many devices. When you get an app on your device, you're using your Google Play account. You all have a username, you have a password. Well, my company doesn't want me to use my personal account on my corporate-owned device. And so how do they deal with that? This is where the Android team came up with the Manage Play account. So this is a method that you can set up accounts that are more corporate owned. And so people don't need to have personal passwords, personal accounts. They can manage things that way. And then we went through the Manage Play Store earlier. So that's the method where that Play Store owner, corporate owner, has that control over what is going through that Manage Play account onto the device. So one of the other services that Google offers as they're doing all the scanning of apps, when they notice a security issue with one of those apps, they actually at times are looking through to detect who is using those apps and who is creating those apps and what apps are dependent on those. And they are actually doing outreach to those users to notify them of that. So this graph, none of this is really readable, but you can see through the usage of this program, they were able to notify almost 300,000 users and app developers of issues that were in apps that had come out. So this is an active program that has been in place and continues to be in place. So another two programs that Android has. So they have Android Security Rewards. So that is looking at the operating system and kind of the general environment of Android, where they are paying people who are able to identify vulnerabilities. And then last month, they also launched the Google Play Security Reward Program, and that's targeted at apps and the Play Store so that people who are able to identify those malicious apps and activity can report those and be rewarded for that as well. Some of this kind of ties in with this payment around the fact that Android is open source. So clearly that does open it up to allow people to know what's inside, able to identify more vulnerabilities, but at the same time, they're trying to take advantage of that by having the security community analyze that, give them feedback. Whereas you look at, Apple, for instance, that is all locked down. Other people aren't getting their eyes into that to notify them of some of those issues. So SafetyNet is an area that launched earlier this year, and this is directly targeted at developers. So this is something we would strongly encourage all of you to take advantage of. So the first one here is attestation. So what this is doing is this is looking at if you include these APIs in your application, what it's going to do is it's going to test that device that your application is running on and make sure that it has not been rooted, that it is a standard device, and there are no issues with it. So when you think of this, the reason this is in place is if you have any information in your application, so let's say you have a financing application, you want to make sure that that user does not have any potential issues that could then trigger an issue for that user or potentially through your app to maybe a financial institution. So really, the financial example here is kind of an extreme, but to be honest, personal identifiable information is something that we actually are legally responsible for. And so even information like that, we have to be careful about to make sure that we are not exposing that to anyone else. So that's a value. So attestation, that's looking at the device level. Verify apps is looking at the app level. So you include these APIs in your application, and it then checks if there are any known applications on that device that have security issues. So any known security issues with other apps on the device. So again, if there's something going on that you don't want to happen on that device, you can make sure your application's not exposed to that activity, so it reduces the risk of something happening through your application. So I'm actually just kind of curious if people in the room are using either of these today. All right, so we have a few people, so that's good, because some of the numbers that I had seen, like attestation, was very, very low adoption. And I understand, some apps, people want to make sure anyone can run it, but at the same time, we really all need to bear this whole security responsibility. Safe browsing is pretty straightforward. So that's looking through a list of known URLs that are malicious and making sure that none of those are being used through your application. And I think we all know what CAPTCHAs are. So just making sure that an actual user is entering the information rather than some kind of machine. So all of this information, it's all documented online. So there's the long URL there, but if you just do a Google search, you can pretty easily find a lot of documentation around these APIs. So last, I was gonna just kind of briefly talk about the ecosystem updates. So at the very beginning, we talked about Blueborn. We talked about some of those other issues and how Google was notified by a research firm who identified those issues. They made the security change and they pushed that out. So at this point, Google regularly is doing monthly security updates. You can find that information online. They do a monthly security report, talks about the vulnerabilities and issues that they have addressed, and all of those are then pushed out to their partner community. At the same time, application developers, they're trying to push that information out, so you guys are aware of that as well. So next I wanted to talk about what Zebra is doing. So we have a philosophy, we really look at prevention. So prevention is looking at unauthorized users, making sure you don't give unauthorized users access to things they shouldn't, that you are not installing unauthorized applications, making sure that the user is not launching an application that they shouldn't, as well as making sure that the proper privilege of someone is at the right level and that you don't have access to more that you should be. So that whole prevention thing, that's one of the better ways to make sure you're maintaining security. But then there's also detection. So we try to make sure, I talked about that privilege escalation. What are people actually accessing versus what they're supposed to? We try to have some software suites to help out with that. And then monthly, the security updates is something, and I'm going to dive into that, our approach on that. So we have something we call MX. It's our mobility extensions. These are some software that we include with all of our Android devices. So this lets our customers do things like manage the certificates that are on there. When people are putting SD cards in, the controls that are there so that someone's not inadvertently or maliciously intending to do something there. Screen lock, so how are you managing things along those lines with locking the screens, application enablement, a lot of different areas around that. So this is something that we offer. Another area that Zebra plays in, when we talk about those monthly security updates, we get those from the Android team. We make sure each of those updates goes out to our community as well. But what we found is in the enterprise space, a user doesn't want to use their device for just 2 years. They often want to use their device for 5 years, and they want to continue to purchase more things along those lines. So we need to make sure that we are offering these same security updates through that full life cycle of that device. So Zebra has a program we call Lifeguard, where we are really extending that the security update life cycle. So to give a little more example of what we do, so even just on the device side, our customers want to be able to purchase that device for the life cycle. They want to be able to purchase the accessories that go with that. So on our devices, your battery on your phone is not going to last that full 5 years. You're going to want to be able to buy replacement batteries to update that. That's something we offer as well. That's just the device side. And then as I was mentioning, on the security side, standard Android, you're going to be doing those 30-day updates, which we do, and then looking at the patch levels. And so Android is doing that really for the first 36 months, sometimes 40 months. We are extending that for the full 5 years. So I hope, going through this whole talk, you guys have heard that, there's a lot of different areas within security with the access control, how users are being managed, how the device is being managed as you're building your application, and getting those applications on the devices. So there's this whole ecosystem. And I hope as you're going forward, you guys are going to take each of these seriously, try to think of how you can enhance the security within each of those stages that you play in. So that was my spiel. I have a few links here, so if you guys want to look through just some of the Android sites that they have, there's the security reports that they put out, there's the monthly updates, and some of the information on their blog as well. And then Zebra, we have our own developer portal, developer.zebra.com, and that lifeguard program with our security updates. So that's my overview, and now I just wanted to see if there are any questions, and if there are, if you guys can go to the microphone that's in the middle so we have that recorded and everyone can hear you.
I have one question. So for some devices, maybe running the old Android versions, maybe like 2 or 3 years old, and then I think the organization may still want to use those devices, but maybe those hardware cannot support the latest Android version. Then how can you apply the security patch for them? Let's assume, let's say Google does not have support for those versions. Yeah.
Right. So to address that, we do try to encourage all of our users to update as much as you can, but then there's that limit. And so when we do the patches, it's not a full OS update, it's just a patch that you're able to put on there. And we do have updates even for our KitKat offerings at this point that we are adding on. And so some of those updates Google's giving us, we do have the opportunity to apply those to not just the latest flavors, but some of the older flavors of Android as well. Okay. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate your time.